Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming from all those distant places. And thank you to the musicians. I thought your music was just terrific. And I'd love to hear you sing about "I'm only afraid of what you do in the name of your God" in every church I've ever been to. But let me say, first of all, to the members of this congregation and to Roger, how delighted I am to be back in this unusual community of faith. I don't think I know of any congregation that I've visited in my entire career that is quite like this one. You're located in the heart of the United States. You're in a city that is the headquarters and the ministry training center for the Assemblies of God. And yet this church, under this pastor, has dared to define itself differently. It's not that you want to be negative to traditional Christian views, so much as you want to expand the possibilities for people living in our time who cannot bend their minds into a first century pretzel in order to be comfortable with the traditional views. I was raised in the same culture that produced Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell, and Pat Robertson. Indeed, when I was a child, carrying the Charlotte Observer from about 4:30 in the morning till about 6 o'clock in the morning, the last paper on my Charlotte Observer paper route was the Graham Brothers Dairy Farm, where Billy's father, Frank, ran the dairy, and where Billy grew up and lived. Now, Billy was about 12 years older than I, so I didn't really know him. When you're 12, you don't know somebody that's 24. But there was a big family, and he had a sister named Jean who was just 1 year behind me in school. I knew her quite well. She was a lovely blonde. I frequently thought I'd like to date her, but I was afraid, because if I tried to park, she'd try to save me. And the last thing you want to have happen to you when you're trying to park is to get saved. I have a great deal of respect for the integrity of Billy Graham. But if I were going to produce a movie of his life and thought, I would have to go to a studio called 18th Century Fox to do it. And when you read his autobiography, you will discover that he knows better than he says. Because in the autobiography, he had a faith crisis when he went to Wheaton College, which is a very evangelical fundamentalist school. And he decided that he would not allow any questions about the Bible to interfere with his message of converting people. And he lived his life with that premise. When I was 34 years old, I went to be the rector of St. John's Episcopal Church in Lynchburg, Virginia, and discovered myself living in the town with a young Jerry Falwell. Jerry was a mountain man, sort of a typical southern redneck preacher. Not an evil man, but a limited man. But he knew how to do show business, and he turned his church into a great show business. There'd be an advertisement in the Saturday paper, "Come to Sunday school, we want to have 10,000 people here." And if you came, you could listen to the chaplain of Bourbon Street give his witness. You could see Miss America prance across the stage, and every now and then they'd get someone to come in and wrestle a bear. And people would come in great numbers. Jerry Falwell filled them with his particular understanding of Christianity. He was deeply racist. The Liberty Baptist University that he founded started as a segregation academy. I've heard Jerry Falwell say things like, "Nelson Mandela is a communist. He ought to be in jail. Only the South African apartheid regime is saving the continent of Africa from going to be a totally communist country." Jerry changed on a lot of things. One of the things he did not change on was his attitude toward gay and lesbian people. He was very bitter. very negative, very hostile. Because Jerry achieved such a great reputation in this country, a publisher decided that he should write his autobiography. He had a great audience. They would be out to listen or to buy it, to hear it. The trouble was Jerry didn't know how to write. And so he hired a ghostwriter. This ghostwriter, whose name was Mel White, lived with Jerry very closely for about 2 years while he wrote Jerry Falwell's autobiography. And when the autobiography came out, Mel White came out. And it became obvious that the person with whom Jerry had been very closely associated for 2 years as he told his life story was himself a gay man. And Mel White formed an organization called Soul Force. And one of the things he tried to do was to get Jerry to be more or less hostile publicly in his attitude toward homosexual people. So he would picket Jerry Falwell's church. And he finally got Jerry to agree that he would meet with 200 born-again evangelical gay and lesbian Christians. Well, Jerry didn't believe there were 200 born-again evangelical gay and lesbian Christians, so he agreed to meet with them and to eat with them. This was in the year 2000 when we were having a presidential race, and George W. Bush, was running against John McCain, and there was a religious right candidate named Gary Bauer in the race. When Gary Bauer heard that Jerry was going to meet with these 200 born-again homosexual people, he sent him a wire and said, "You're tearing up my campaign." And so Jerry got cold feet and backed out. And upon pressure from Mel White, Jerry finally agreed that he would meet with them because he had given his word. But he said, "I will not eat with them, because the Bible says you cannot eat with sinners." So he said, "Jerry, who do you eat with?" "Jerry, can you even eat alone?" It was pretty obvious that Jerry ate. But he was quite convinced that the Bible justified his prejudice. In the year 1966, Virginia had a Democratic senatorial primary. The senator was named A. Willis Robertson. He'd been in the Senate of the United States for 4 terms. He was running for a 5th. He was 78 years old. He was challenged by a young state senator from Portsmouth. His name was William Belser Spong, Jr. He was my first cousin and my very close friend. It was an interesting race. Bill defeated him in the Democratic primary, and in Virginia in 1966, that was tantamount to election. You never ran against a Republican because there just weren't any Republicans. I was 16 years old before I knew that damn Yankee wasn't one word. And the Republicans represented those people who had forced the oppression of the South after the Civil War. And so my cousin won that election by 611 votes out of 880,000 cast. We called him Landslide Spong. I don't even remember who the Republican candidate against him was because he didn't even campaign. It was just a name that nobody had ever heard. But you've listened to Pat Robertson quote the Bible in justification of the most incredible things. Why did we have an earthquake in Haiti? It's because God was punishing the Haitians for throwing the French out in the early years of the 19th century. Why did the hurricane strike New Orleans? Because it's the birthplace of Ellen DeGeneres. Folks, there's not a town in the United States that hadn't been the birthplace of some gay or lesbian person. But that's the kind of thinking that was on the public media that represented God. I grew up in that kind of world. The church I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, I am a North Carolinian, Roger. You were asking if there was anybody from North Carolina here. The church I grew up in taught me that segregation was the will of God. and they quoted the Bible to prove it. They taught me that women were born inferior to men, and they quoted the Bible to prove it. They taught me that it was okay to hate other religions, and especially the Jews, and they quoted the Bible to prove it. They taught me that homosexual people were either mentally sick or morally depraved, and they quoted the Bible to prove it. That's the kind of introduction I had to Christianity. And as those prejudices began to die in me, and it was over a period of years, the civil rights movement put an end to my racism. Oh, I wasn't terribly creative and courageous in those days. I think I was 25 years old when the march from Selma took place, and I didn't go down and join Dr. King in that march. But in my little church in eastern North Carolina, a little town of 7,500 people, I had us open our service that Sunday with the hymn, "Lead On, O King Eternal," and I thought that was so clever. But not a soul got it. It was a witness that just simply passed. I got over my sexism by having daughters. That'll do it to you. I said to the Archbishop of Newark on one occasion that if your priest had daughters, they wouldn't be so sexist. And he looked at me as if he didn't know how to process that sentence. I lived in an all-female household. No toilet seat was ever up. We had a male cat, and they operated on him. It was simply not safe to be a male in that household. But because I began to look at life through the eyes of my daughters, I began to see some things that I could never have seen trying to look at life through the eyes of my mother or even the eyes of my wife. And so my sexism began to be broken. When I was still in Lynchburg, I went to Temple B'nai Or periodically on Sabbath evenings, Friday evenings. I was drawn to that worship because the Jewish people seemed happy. Episcopalians didn't seem happy to me. I hope you are, my token Episcopalian here. But they didn't seem happy. I was sort of raised in the tradition that if you enjoyed it, it was either sinful or fattening. And I'd watch Episcopalians come down from receiving communion at the altar, and they all looked like they'd lost their last friend. They'd walk like this. I said that to a surgeon friend of mine, and he said, "Jack, they don't look like they've lost their last friend to me." And I said, "What do they look like to you, Ed?" And he said, "They look like they're all suffering with hemorrhoids." I must say, I've never been able to watch Episcopalians come back from communion without thinking of that. This doctor went on to say that every doctor and every clergyman ought to have hemorrhoids. I said, "Why is that, Ed?" And he said, "Because it puts a look of perpetual concern on your faces, and it causes you to walk with an air of quiet dignity." But the Jewish people taught me to look at Jesus through Jewish eyes. He's always going to banquets. There's a story in the fourth gospel where he turned water into wine so the wedding feast could go on. No preacher in the South I grew up could have gotten away with such a trick. They were life-affirming, and the Christianity I grew up with was life-denying. And that was a powerful witness to me. And so as I began to look at Jesus within the context of the Jewish world that produced him, I saw a very different picture. The hardest thing for me to get over was my homophobia. Indeed, I was a bishop before I got over my homophobia. It was so clear to me. I didn't know the word homosexual until I was 16 years old. We just didn't have homosexuals in the South. And when I finally discovered there was such a thing as a homosexual, I accepted the definition of my region. The liberal position was that they can't help it, they're mentally sick, so you try to cure them. The conservative position was they were morally depraved, So you try to convert them, and if you can't convert them, then bash them. You can even kill them if their name is Matthew Shepard. And that didn't make much sense to me. And of course, they quoted the Bible to demonstrate that they were only doing God's will. Now, usually when people get disillusioned with the religion in which they have been raised, they simply abandon religion. That's the easiest thing to do. For reasons that I do not fully understand, that was not something I was able to do. My decision was that religion, my Christianity, had to mean more than the stuff that I had been presented with. And so for reasons that are beyond my comprehension, I began to do serious study of the Scriptures to see if they were really being quoted accurately. I must say that's a very dangerous thing to do. No fundamentalist really wants you to read the Bible. Because when you read the Bible, you'll discover things that nobody ever talks about. Some time ago, I was asked to deliver a paper or give a lecture at something called the Hemlock Society. It's now called Compassion in Dying. It's this Oregon outfit that supports a person's right to determine how and when they shall die. They had never had a clergyman speak to this organization before because clergy, by and large, would say that suicide is a sin. Well, in order to prepare for this, I went through the Bible and picked out every sin for which the Bible says you ought to be put to death. Folks, there wouldn't be a one of us still living. The book of Deuteronomy says that if you talk back to your parents and are willfully disobedient, you shall be taken to the elders of the city and stoned until dead at the gates of the city. Please raise your hands, those of you who would still be alive today. The Bible says if you commit adultery or have sex outside of marriage, you shall be put to death, and I will not ask you to raise your hands to see if you would still be alive. The Bible says you shall be put to death if you worship a false god. Well, who is going to tell you who the true God is? Is it going to be the Pope? Is it going to be the Ayatollah? Is it going to be Pat Robertson? Is it going to be Ian Paisley? No matter who defines the true God, somebody's life is at risk. Does any human being know the true God? Is there not, as Paul Tillich used to say, a God beyond the gods of men and women's understanding? The one that I enjoyed the most when I discovered it is in Leviticus 20. You can go home and look it up. I've learned to quote the Bible just like the people on the street corners. It's not a text you'll ever hear preached on, but in Leviticus 20 it says, you shall be put to death if you have sex with your mother-in-law. Now, how many of you knew that was in the Bible? How many of you ever heard it preached on? You know, clergy aren't going to preach on something that most people can't imagine doing. And when you laugh, it's because you've just tried to imagine it. So as I read the Bible, I came to some very different conclusions. And that sent me into a lifetime of biblical study. And I'm going to talk about that Bible this evening. But I can't talk about it all. There's 66 books in the Bible. That's without the Apocrypha. And they were written over a period of about 1,000 years, roughly from 1000 BCE until about 130 or 140 of this common era, written by a wide variety of authors. I've tried to address the whole book in some books I've written. One was called Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism. Another was called Reclaiming the Bible for a Non-Religious World, where in the course of 300 to 400 pages you can look at everything in the Bible, at least superficially, but I can't do that on a weekend. So what I've decided to do is to take one single book of the Bible and try to introduce you to it in a non-literalistic way and see if that doesn't illumine some things that are very, very different. And the book I've chosen is the Gospel of John. I didn't choose it willy-nilly. I chose it because it was one of the last books of the Bible that I personally could come to appreciate. I didn't appreciate the fourth gospel, primarily because I could not find Jesus' humanity in it. He seemed to be a divine visitor from outer space. This gospel suggests he was pre-existent. It suggests that he is clairvoyant. It suggests that he is identical with God. It suggests that he's sort of God in disguise. The Jesus I thought I would meet in the fourth gospel was to God something like Clark Kent is to Superman. He was God in disguise. You didn't know he was really God. You really thought he was human until he went into the phone booth and took off his shirt, and the big S appeared on his chest. So I was not drawn to the Gospel of John. The second reason I did not care for this gospel was that this gospel seemed to me to smell of anti-Semitism. I'd gotten through my anti-Semitism, and I didn't want to find it in the Scriptures. And yet in the fourth gospel, it seemed to me that every time the author used the phrase, the Jews, he almost spit it out of his mouth with contempt. And the fourth gospel is the only gospel that portrays Jesus as saying that the Jews are the children of the devil. Sounds rather un-Jesus-like to me. You don't hear Christians quoting that very often. So I was not interested in a book that seemed to me to perpetuate what I think is the deepest shame in Christian history, the biggest blot on our integrity as Christians, the way we have treated Jews through the centuries. But it's awfully hard to avoid the Gospel of John when you're a priest or a bishop. The Gospel of John feeds our hearts and our minds and our souls at almost every funeral that we attend in the Christian church. You might not be aware that you're hearing the words of John's Gospel because most people don't separate them, but you are. Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. That's from John. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. That's from the Gospel of John. I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He who believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. That's the Gospel of John. You can almost not have a Christian funeral without readings from St. John. So John's words have permeated into the lives of Christian people in our society very, very deeply. But it took me a long time to get over my negativity to this book. In the year 2005, for a number of reasons that I don't have time to go into, I began to do an intensive study of the fourth gospel. From 2005 until 2011, I hardly read anything else. I read every major commentary in the English language from the 19th, 20th, and 21st century on the Gospel of John. Those are not little books. They're 1,200 pages and 1,600 pages and 2,200 pages, long, long commentaries. And in that period of time, I came to a very different understanding of this book. So I'd like to share with you some of that understanding. And I'd like to do it in simple language with just stating some facts that sometimes surprise people. Fact number one, the gospel we call John is the last of the four gospels to be written. It was written between the years 95 and 100. That means it was written 65 to 70 years after the crucifixion. 65 to 70 years. In a period of history where a generation was about 20 years at most, this means that we need to embrace the fact that the Gospel of John is a product of the third generation of Christians. These are not eyewitnesses. This is the third generation. A corollary to this simple fact is that John Zebedee is clearly not the author. That's a bit of 2nd century AD or CE, pious propaganda to associate John Zebedee with the writing of the fourth gospel. Folks, if John Zebedee wrote the fourth gospel, he was close to 90 years of age. Nobody lived to be 90 in that era. Secondly, John Zebedee was a fisherman. He was a Galilean fisherman. In a society where only one person out of 100 could read, and in a society where only one person out of 1,000 could write. And no Galilean fisherman could either read or write. They would not have been a Galilean fisherman if they had been able to. They could have sold their talents for a much higher level of compensation. John Zebedee is even described in the book of Acts as an unlearned man. The fourth gospel is written in classical, learned Greek. No Galilean fisherman could possibly have written that book. So we're not dealing with an eyewitness. We're dealing with something very, very different. And one of the ways that you do Bible study today is to try to separate the book from the blending of the Bible that is in most of our minds. Most of us have a vague sense of the Jesus story, but we have no sense that this fact came out of Mark, and this one out of Matthew, and this one out of Luke, and this one out of John, because we don't put those together. We act as if they were always bound in one book, and that they're supposed to complement each other. So we blend them. It's sort of like making sausage. You never can separate what went into the sausage once it's put into the sausage. And we do this in all sorts of ways in our lives. All of you go to Christmas pageants once in a while. Every Christmas pageant I've ever seen puts the cause of biblical scholarship back another 50 years. What we do in Christmas pageants is to blend Matthew's story, which is the oldest one, with Luke's story, which is the latest one, and they don't fit, but we make them fit. And we make them fit in Christmas pageants by following Luke's storyline till we get to the end. Then we tack on Matthew's wise men as the final scene. But there's so many incompatibilities in these two stories that we're not aware of. In Matthew, Mary and Joseph live in a house in Bethlehem. It's so recognizable that a star can stop over it and bathe it in its light. So there's no need to go down to Bethlehem to be enrolled. They already live there. It's only in Luke that they live in Nazareth, and so they have to go down to be enrolled in some sort of taxation, which in itself is absurd. Can you imagine some emperor, some president of the United States, some member of the Tea Party? Can you imagine anybody saying we're going to have a national enrollment and you've got to go back to your ancestral home, and Joseph had to go back to Bethlehem because he was the heir of King David? Folks, there are 1,000 years between King David and Joseph. King David had over 300 wives. God knows how many direct descendants he had. And if you trace it through 1,000 years, that's 50 generations. There would be over 1 billion direct descendants of King David. And they all had to go back. How many of you know where your ancestors were 1,000 years ago? Can you imagine 1 billion people making headway toward Bethlehem, a town of some 300? It's no wonder there was no room in the inn. And besides that, Quirinius did not become governor of Syria until Jesus was about 10 or 11 years old. We know that from other history. So these stories aren't meant to be literal, and they certainly aren't meant to be blended. In Matthew's story, the Christ child is under threat by King Herod, so they have to flee down to Egypt. And only later, when King Herod dies, does a vision of an angel tell them they can come back to Bethlehem where they had a home. And then they hear that King Herod's son is on the throne. He's just as bad as King Herod. It's sort of like getting George II after you've had George I. And so they flee up to Galilee. And this is supposed to be led by an angel or a vision. But in Luke's story, as soon as the baby has been born and the circumcision has taken place on the 7th day, and the presentation in the temple takes place on the 40th day, then they leisurely make their way back to their home in Nazareth. These stories are not compatible. They were not written to supplement each other. They were not written to be the fodder of our Christmas pageants. We blend them because that's the way we remember the Bible. Get to the other end of Jesus' life, you have the similar problem. How many of you have ever been to a church on Good Friday that said the sermons would be on the 7 last words that Jesus spoke from the cross? Well, that's a nice scheme, only trouble is he never spoke 7 last words from the cross. And the only way they get to 7 is they take the one word he spoke from the cross in the first 2 Gospels, Mark and Matthew, which Luke threw out and put in 3 brand new ones. And John comes along, he throws out everything that was in Mark, Matthew, and Luke and puts in 3 that nobody's ever heard of before. And only by adding them up do you get 7. The certainty is that Jesus never spoke all 7. The probability is he never spoke any one of them. But we've blended the story because that's the way we approach the Bible. So what I'd like to do in the remaining time, and I do hope we'll have time to at least have some dialogue after this is over. What I'd like to do in the remaining time is to go through a series of what I call bullet points that enable us to see John's Gospel standing by itself, apart from all of the others, as something different and something unique. So here goes. Bullet point number 1. Some of these may surprise you. There is no story of Jesus' birth in the 4th Gospel. None at all. It's simply not there. Not only is there no story of Jesus having had a miraculous birth in the last Gospel to be written, but on 2 different occasions in the 4th Gospel, once in chapter 1 and once in chapter 6, the author says, without any explanation, that Jesus is the son of Joseph. Now, how many people knew that? We might know there's no birth story in Mark. Paul doesn't seem to know that there was any miraculous birth story. John could not help but have heard about it, writing as late as he did, but he thought it was unworthy, and so he left it out. So if you want to be literal about the Bible, it's 3-2 of the 5 major writers against the virgin birth story being literal. So the Bible's not on the side of the fundamentalist. Bullet point number 2, the mother of Jesus is never called Mary in the 4th Gospel. There are only 2 Marys in the 4th Gospel. One is Mary Magdalene, and the other is Mary, the sister of Martha. The mother of Jesus is never called Mary. And I'll have some more to say about that figure as the weekend develops. Bullet point number 3, John the Baptist does not baptize Jesus in the 4th Gospel. Well, he baptizes him in Mark and Matthew and Luke, but not in the 4th Gospel. All he does in the 4th Gospel is to bear witness to him. By the time the 4th Gospel was written, there was a great dis-ease among Christians at the idea that Jesus might have been baptized by John the Baptist, that John the Baptist might have some supremacy over Jesus. Besides that, John the Baptist's baptism was for the forgiveness of sins. The Christians were saying Jesus was the sinless one. Why did he have to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins if he were sinless? And so the story fades in the 4th Gospel. And John the Baptist never baptizes Jesus. The next bullet point. There are no parables of Jesus in the 4th Gospel. They simply aren't there. Jesus never speaks in parables in the 4th Gospel. Jesus never gives short, pithy, easy-to-remember sayings in the 4th Gospel. The only time Jesus speaks in the 4th Gospel, it's in long, sometimes convoluted dialogues and monologues. Discourses. Chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16 in the 4th Gospel are all the farewell discourses of Jesus. Long, tedious sayings. Nothing short, nothing memorable. And even that's funny because when you get to chapter 14, halfway through these long discourses, Jesus says, "Rise, let us be going." But nobody gets up and he goes on for 2 more chapters, 15 and 16. So the Jesus you meet in the 4th Gospel never gives parables or short, pithy, easy-to-remember sayings. Next bullet point, there's no story of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness by the forces of the devil in the fourth gospel. There's no story of Jesus being transfigured on the Mount of Transfiguration and Moses and Elijah chatting with him in the fourth gospel. There is no Sermon on the Mount or anything close to it in the fourth gospel. The next bullet point. Miracles have been changed into something that John calls signs. There is a difference. A miracle is sort of an objective event that you can see and try to describe. A sign is a subjective event that points to some reality far beyond itself, that's filled with mystery. And John tells us 7 signs. They're in what we call the book of signs. They fill up the chapters from chapter 2 to chapter 11. The middle 5 of the 7 are at least similar to miracle stories that have been told in the earlier Gospels. But the first one and the last one, nobody's ever heard of before. The first sign was the changing of water into wine at a wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. It's the first place where the mother of Jesus makes her appearance. Jesus has gone with his mother and his closest friends, his disciples, to a wedding. Wonder whose wedding it was. But Jesus' mother is placed into the role of the mother of the groom. In Jewish society, it was the groom's family that entertained at the wedding feast. And so when they run out of wine in this story, they come to Mary because she's in charge, except they don't call her Mary. They come to the mother of Jesus. And she tries to force Jesus to act. And he rebukes her rather harshly. He tells her that his time has not yet come. Mary stands in that story somewhere between the mother of the Christian movement and the Christian movement, somewhere between the purification waters of Jewish worship and the Eucharistic wine of Christian worship. Wonder what that story is all about. We'll come back to it later. The last of the 7 signs is the story of the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Nobody's ever heard of this story before. It doesn't appear in any gospel. And yet it's portrayed in the 11th chapter of John's gospel as an objective event. And you begin to be suspicious about this story because it introduces Lazarus as the brother of Mary and Martha. Well, that's interesting because we've met Mary and Martha in the gospel tradition earlier, but they never had a brother named Lazarus. So Lazarus seems to appear out of thin air. The story is also interesting in a lot of other ways. Jesus gets a message that his close friend Lazarus is sick, and he deliberately does not go. And they berate him when he gets there. Master, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Both Mary and Martha say that. There's something going on in this story besides history. And by the time Jesus gets there, Lazarus is not only dead, but he's buried. He's been in the tomb for 4 days. He's bound in the burial cloths, where they would bind the arms to the side and tie the legs together before they put him into the tomb. By the time Jesus gets there, his flesh has already begun to decay. How do we know? Because Martha says, Jesus, please don't open the tomb. He's been dead 4 days. And the King James Bible says, quote, and already he stinketh, unquote. The Revised Standard Version is a little more circumspect. It says, already there will be an odor. The next thing that's unusual about this story is that there are a lot of people there. It's a great big public event. The mourners are still around, and some of them are Jesus' most severe critics. So here you have a public event of a man who is dead and buried for 4 days, whose flesh is already beginning to decay. And Jesus goes out to the cave, orders a stone taken away, and calls for the dead man to come forth. And here he comes, looking like a refugee from the Addams family. And nobody writes about that story for 65 years? Can that be literal? Are any of the signs literal? The first one and the seventh one certainly seem to be symbolic stories. But in John's Gospel, miracles have been turned into signs. That's very different. The next bullet point is that John introduces characters into his story that nobody's ever heard of before. They're not just insignificant characters. John suggests that there are 2 members of Jesus' band of 12 that nobody's ever heard of before. And he introduces them with great fanfare. One is a man named Nathaniel. There's no Nathaniel in the list of the 12 disciples in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, and all of them have a list. No Nathaniel in the book of Acts, where there's also a list. But here's Nathaniel, a brand new member of the 12 that nobody's ever heard of before, and this is 65 to 70 years after the crucifixion. Where was Nathaniel hiding when the others were writing their Gospels? Or is Nathaniel a different kind of character? He gets a very elaborate introduction. He's in the first chapter. He's called directly by Jesus. We'll come back to him, but I want to plant that seed. The other of the 12 that nobody's ever heard of before is a very enigmatic figure that doesn't come into John's story until the 13th chapter. And that's when they're at the Last Supper. And suddenly this character appears that nobody's ever heard of before. And he's not only at the Last Supper, he's seated next to Jesus, leaning on Jesus' breast. And he does not have a name. He's simply called the disciple whom Jesus loved. And you and I refer to him as the beloved disciple. He enters the story in chapter 13. But he dominates John's Gospel from that point on. He's the only disciple to go to the cross with Jesus. He's the first one to come to the tomb. He's the first one to believe. Who is this person? Well, that's where the John Zebedee comes in, because people tried to figure out who the beloved disciple was, and they decided it had to be John Zebedee, because the name of John means beloved one. That's why I was named John. I was the beloved one to my mother and father, just like everybody else is beloved to their mother and father. But when John didn't seem to fit, scholars kept trying to find new people that they could put in there. Maybe the beloved disciple was Thomas. I've read a 400-page book trying to prove that beyond the shadow of reasonable doubt. Maybe it was James, the brother of Jesus. Maybe it was Mary Magdalene. That has a little cachet. There was a tradition deep in the Christian world that there was something more than just friendship in the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. We see that even in Jesus Christ Superstar, where Magdalene sings a love song to Jesus. I don't know how to love him. Lots of medieval literature about a loving relationship between Jesus and Magdalene. The suggestion that if Jesus were married, Magdalene was clearly the candidate to be his wife. That's also in the tradition. You can make a case for that. I think the most unusual of all is that people said, well, Lazarus was clearly the beloved disciple, as if Lazarus were somehow a figure of history. The characters that get introduced into John's Gospel are very unusual. Lots of them have never been heard of before. Where do they hide? Why didn't Matthew, Mark, and Luke know about them? Or is there something unique about John's characters? Are they literary characters and not historical people? Are they more like Sherlock Holmes and Harry Potter and Jane Eyre and Wonder Woman than they are about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Mother Teresa? And so you begin to wonder whether these characters were the creations of the author. They're beautifully drawn, memorably drawn. Let me just list some of them. Most of you have some image of them. There was Nicodemus, the ruler of the Jews. He doesn't appear anywhere else in the Christian tradition. There was a Samaritan woman by the well. There was a Gentile official whose child was healed. There was a man who was crippled for 38 years. 38 years is longer than the average lifetime in the first century. This is a lifetime crippled person. There was the man born blind that somehow Jesus enables to see. All these characters that nobody's ever heard of before, and we're now talking about 65 to 70 years after the crucifixion. So maybe a clue to get into the Gospel of John is to understand what these characters mean, why they were created, and how it is that John weaves his Jesus story around these characters. There's another group of characters in John's Gospel that are people that have been heard of before, but John has given them personalities that they never had before. And top on that list is Mary, the mother of Jesus. She's clearly in the tradition. Clearly Jesus had a mother. There's a person of history somewhere that was the mother of Jesus of Nazareth. But the mother of Jesus that you meet in John's Gospel is clearly symbolic. She stands at a transition point between Judaism and Christianity. She is the mother of Christianity. She's a symbol. And there are others. Thomas in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is simply a name on a list, not a single biographical detail. But in John, he becomes Doubting Thomas. And everybody knows something about his story. Andrew, the only thing you know about Andrew in Matthew, Mark, and Luke was that he was Peter's brother. But John tells us 3 stories about Andrew that give him a personality. He's sort of the ordinary person who sees extraordinary possibilities in everyone. And Philip, who knows anything about Philip? In John's Gospel, Philip is given character and personality and persona. So what is the meaning of all of John's characters, either those that we've never heard of before or those that we have heard of but who have been given a totally different look? It's an interesting way to go into the 4th Gospel. And it opens all kinds of possibilities for reading the Bible with non-literal eyes. A couple of more bullet points, and then I'll stop. The 21st chapter of John's Gospel is called the Epilogue, and it is very clear that it was not written by the same person who wrote the first part of that Gospel. It makes no sense to put them together. If you read the 20th chapter clearly, the author has wrapped up his story and put a final period on it. And then suddenly there's chapter 21. And chapter 21 assumes that nothing that's happened from the time of the crucifixion to the time of the resurrection is known by anybody. And it's a story dedicated more than anything else to the rehabilitation of Peter. The famous conversation, Peter, do you love me? Well, feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Well, feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Well, feed my sheep. So the disciple who had denied 3 times has to assert his loyalty 3 times. It's a very strange chapter and very different from the rest of John, and clearly not by the same author. But the last bullet point that I will go into tonight is the one that will be the background of the final presentation on Sunday morning. And that is, John treats the cross in a way very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The cross for John is not a tragedy. It's a triumph. The cross in John is not something to be avoided. So nowhere in John's gospel will you hear Jesus praying, "Father, let this cup pass from me." The cross is something to be embraced. So in John's gospel, Jesus says, "Should I deny this cup? No, I was born to drink this cup." Nowhere in John's gospel do you hear Jesus say from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" No, the Jesus who speaks from the cross in John's gospel says, "It is finished. The work of salvation is over. The work of the new creation is complete. It is finished. It is complete. I've done what was asked of me to do." It's a very different view of the cross. The cross in the fourth gospel is the climax of the story. John's gospel does not climax with the resurrection or the ascension or Pentecost. It reaches its climax in the cross. This is the hour for which he was born. This is the hour for which he lived. This was the moment when he would be revealed. "When I am lifted up on the cross," says the Johannine Jesus, "then they will know I am." That's the name of God. When I'm lifted up on the cross, then they will know who God is. It's not tragedy. It's triumph. It's not to be avoided. It's the place of ultimate revelation. Nobody in John's gospel could ever have said, "Jesus died for my sins." And I'll look at that in much more detail on Sunday morning. That's enough, I hope, just to separate this book in your minds from the hodgepodge of blended gospel narratives, the homogenized form, the sausage into which we have made the gospel tradition. What I'd like to do in the sessions tomorrow is first to develop the reasons why John tells us over and over and over and over again that this gospel cannot be read literally, that this is not history, these are not tape recordings. This is a portrait being painted by a Jewish artist. You do not read the fourth gospel literally and have it make sense. And then in the second presentation tomorrow, I will take the characters and develop 2 or 3 of them in much more detail so that it becomes clear and obvious that John is developing storylines, not writing historical features. He is interpreting the impact of the life of Jesus upon a number of individuals who are representative of different types of human beings. John's gospel was not meant to be a biography. It was not to be history. He had no tape recorder whereby he could recall exactly what Jesus said. He creates all of the sayings that he places into the mouth of Jesus. Can you imagine, for example, Jesus wandering around in either Galilee or in Jerusalem and saying, "Oh, by the way, I am the bread of life. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you." If somebody came into this room and started saying that, wouldn't you go after him with a butterfly net and put him in an institution? And when you read John's gospel literally, you get radical absurdities. When you read John's gospel in the way I think this gospel was meant to be read, you see it as a call into the fullness of our humanity. And Jesus becomes the symbol of what the fullness of our humanity looks like. So as you learn to read the Bible with a different set of eyes than the ones with which most of us were trained to read the Bible in our childhood, in our culture, and in our society, you don't lose it. It doesn't disappear because it's no longer literal. It doesn't just become nonsense or have to close your minds and say, I believe it because it's the Word of God. There's another way to read this book. And you go underneath the layers and you penetrate the mind of the authors who created the story, and in this case, particularly the author we call John. And you find it's not a story about religion at all. It's a story about life, about love, about humanity, about acting in such a way as you enhance the humanity of other people. And the more deeply and fully human you and I become, the more we too, like Jesus, can be a life through which God is perceived to be living. Well, I hope that's enough to stimulate your imaginations tonight and to start you on the course of this weekend. And if we have time, Roger, could I take a couple of questions, or do we have time?
We have time. It just keeps us from going out to the beer tent out front, Bishop Spong, but we can deal with that.
I can compete with a lot of things. I'm not sure I can compete with the beer. Let's say we'll take 4 questions, 2 men and 2 women, and I'll try to be brief in my answers. And I always like to start with a woman because the church has been sexist for so long. I think we ought to give women a slight advantage. So I'll recognize the first lady who raises her hand. Let's see one in the back. Do we have a microphone for the first lady? If we don't, shout loudly so they can get it on the video. Do we have a microphone? The most what? Sexist. He has the least to say about women. All right. Get your microphone so we can all hear you.
Okay. Now
I heard the first line. You don't like John.
I don't like John.
Okay. Now tell us why.
Because he has the least to say about women.
And what do you base that on?
From reading the Bible.
Okay. Well, I would suggest...
So I want to ask you if tomorrow and Sunday, will you talk about John and how he addresses women and their roles?
Well, I hadn't planned to because I'm not sure I accept your premise. If you read the 4th chapter of John, he makes the hero of that story the Samaritan woman, and she becomes the first evangelist for the Christian faith, and he goes to Samaria to visit her home. And if you read the 20th chapter, Mary Magdalene becomes the first witness to the resurrection, and she's the one that he bids to go tell the disciples. So it seems to me that John is more favorably inclined to women than Paul, for example.
Yeah, I don't like Paul either.
Paul is, well, I didn't think so. Paul is the one that most women don't like. Women don't like Paul, and Paul doesn't appear to like women, so it's mutual.
I bow to you. Thank you for taking my comment, and I'll look forward to the next couple days.
Well, I'll think about that some more just because you raised it, so thank you for doing that for me. I try to be sensitive to sexism in the Scriptures, but I don't believe that I've confronted it in John near the way I confront it in Paul. And Paul says some really dreadful things. He says, women are to keep quiet in church. Well, that's interesting. And Paul says that I forbid a man to have authority over a woman. It's the other way around. I forbid a woman to have authority over a man. That's right. Well, let me tell you that I have a daughter who is a major in the United States Marine Corps, a helicopter pilot with 3 tours of duty in Mr. Bush's Iraq War. And I can't imagine her finding that text very appealing. You know, when she walked in, the people saluted. They didn't ask whether she was a woman or not. She was a major. And so they saluted. And I think one of the things that women have done in our day is to force people to look at them through a different lens from the one I grew up with, just because of their sheer competence. My church ordained women for the first time in, let me see if I can get the right, I think it was 1977. And so that's 23 plus 14, that's 37 years. In 37 years' time of having women, We now have about half of our clergy who are women. We have about 30 of our bishops who are women. And the head of the entire Episcopal Church, the one we call the primate, is a woman named Catherine Jeffers Shorey. That's rather remarkable progress in 37 years for what had been a beleaguered minority. And women are now in every seminary teaching Scripture and teaching theology, and theology and Scripture are beginning to be subjected to the insights of women. And the hierarchy of the church is beginning to be infected, that's the way some would say it, infected with the presence of women. Because women, and I don't mean to be stereotypical, but women go through a different reasoning process from men. Women are more inclusive, women are more circular, they're less hierarchical. That may be cultural, but it's still a fact. And so the church has benefited enormously from having to deal with women in high places. And that's why I think the two major churches that still don't ordain women, the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, are simply scared to death that their enclaves of holiness will be polluted by the presence of sinful women. And it would be so much to their good if they were so polluted. But thank you for your question. Take a gentleman. Yes, sir. Microphone's got to come all the way to the front. Here it is. You've never looked better, Oprah.
Is there any data or information that points to who might have written John?
Well, not really. In the field of Johannine scholarship today, the debate is not about whether one person wrote it, but how many people wrote it. And the debate is between 3 and 5. That is, scholars believe they have discerned the hands of at least 3 different authors in the chapters of John. Now, the way that I haven't got time to go into how they see that, but there are some radical contradictions in the way Jesus is approached in different parts of the gospel. In some, his titles are very Jewish. He's the prophet of whom Moses spoke. He's the new Moses. He's the new Elijah. In others, he was with God from the beginning, and he became flesh. That's very different. That's very different. Could the same person have written those? Well, if he had grown an awful lot, maybe so. But that's where the debate is. Raymond Brown, who's probably the greatest American Johannine scholar of the 20th century, argues that there are 5 different authors of this gospel, but he cheats a little because he says 2 of them were oral sources, not written sources. Well, I don't know how you trace that. And a man named Urban von Walde, who teaches, I believe, at DePaul in Chicago, has written this massive commentary, 3 volumes, 2,200 pages, and he argues for 3, and he goes through John's gospel and pulls out every verse and assigns it to one of his 3 authors. It's a fascinating study. I'm not willing to make my case with him, but I think it's worth the study. I don't know. I suspect there's more than one. If I had to say, I'd say at least 3, because I think the epilogue is a totally different author, and I find at least 2 authors in the corpus. But who they are, they would be late 1st century people. They would have to speak Greek. They would also have to be Palestinian Jews, because they're so familiar with the landscape in Jerusalem and in Palestine that, they could find a lot of people that fill that category. Thank you. A lady. Yeah, use the mic so we can all hear.
Okay. Is it doing it? Oh, what do I do?
Turn the mic on.
I can talk real loud. I talk to them.
Let me help you.
Okay. Now? Oh, yeah.
Wonderful.
Definitely.
Your previous voice was just beautiful. We just couldn't hear it.
Thank you. My kids didn't think so. My question is, do you think that throughout history, from the writing of that gospel and all the other things that were transpiring in the couple of centuries around that time, have there been folks like you attempting to uncover what the meanings and the purposes really were? And if so, why in the world didn't any of it triumph?
Well, there's a conspiracy in the church not to let lay people know anything about the Bible because they might stop believing. And it's not very healthy for the church if you stop believing because you usually stop contributing. I think I could make the case that what I'm saying about John, John fully understood. And that what happened was that he was later misunderstood. When I look for reasons why he might have been later misunderstood, to me it's very clear. Christianity was born as a movement within Jews. Christianity did not separate from the synagogue until the year 88 of this common era. That is, 58 years after the crucifixion, the Jesus movement was still part of the synagogue. Most people don't embrace that. So by the time it separated, Mark and Matthew had both been written, so they're written under the influence of the synagogue. And when you read them under the influence of the synagogue, they read very differently from when Gentiles, without any Jewish knowledge or background, would read them in future generations. Now, by 150 of this common era, there was hardly a Jew left in the Christian movement. So all of the people who read the Gospels, tried to interpret the Gospels, wrote commentaries on the Gospels, were Gentiles who had no earthly understanding what these Jewish writers were writing about. Let me illustrate that very briefly if I can. In Matthew's Gospel, the father of Jesus, a man named Joseph, is introduced for the first time in Christian history. There's no record of any Joseph anywhere before about 85 when Matthew writes. Mark didn't know anything about a father named Joseph. Paul certainly doesn't know anything about it. He's introduced in Matthew's Gospel about the year 85. That's the first time we've ever heard that there was a father of Jesus named Joseph. And then he disappears. As soon as the birth narratives are over, Joseph disappears. And people say, well, what happened to him? Well, when I was a kid growing up in Holy Comforter Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, I was told that Joseph was a lot older than Mary, and he probably died while Jesus was just a baby, and that accounts for the fact that he disappears from the story. And I accepted that. That seemed rational. Every picture I'd ever seen of Joseph, he was a lot older than Mary. And then I discovered that the idea of Joseph as a very old man comes out of a 2nd century apocryphal gospel named the Proto-Gospel of James. And that gospel purports to tell the story of how Mary was raised from infancy to be the bearer of the Christ child. And she was raised according to the Proto-Gospel of James, about which they know absolutely nothing. That is about Mary's early life. They know absolutely nothing. It's all fantasy. But she's taken and raised by, quote, holy women, so that she can be a properly prepared vessel to bear the Christ child to the world. This is 2nd century. But when Mary gets to be the age of puberty, under Jewish law, she has to have a male protector. And the only two kinds of male protectors of virgin daughters is either a father or a husband. And there's no father in this story. So these holy women seek to find a husband for Mary who will guarantee her perpetual virginity. Well, that cuts down the field of eligible husbands, I would suggest. And so they begin this search, and they decide that what they want to get is the proper protector is a man who's maybe widowed, who's already got grown children, who's older, who has no interest in sex. Now, I don't know how old it is to have no interest in sex, but that's old. And through a series of miraculous events, like his staff spouts flowers and starts growing, the lot sort of falls on this old man named Joseph. And that's where the idea that Joseph is a lot older than Mary comes from. And so that enters the tradition through a totally non-historical source. So then I raise the possibility, suppose that instead of dying young, there never was a Joseph. And that's a startling idea to most people. And I say, well, you don't have to agree with me, but just hold that as a possibility for a minute, and let me ask a couple of questions. If you're going to create an earthly father of Jesus, is there some reason why you might want to name him Joseph? Now, most Gentiles don't have any sense of Jewish history, but if you know anything about Jewish history, you know that the nation of the Jews finally divided into two realms. One was called Judah, and one was called the northern kingdom, or Israel. And the patriarch of the southern kingdom was a man named Judah. He was the fourth son of Leah, or of Jacob, by the wife named Leah. And the patriarch of the northern kingdom, where they had 10 tribes, but really there were just 2 of them that were dominant, and one was named Ephraim and one was named Manasseh. And Jacob didn't have any sons named Ephraim and Manasseh. But what happened was that Joseph was such a significant patriarch that when the Levites decided not to have a tribe and to become the holy people, they were one short, so they broke the Joseph tribe into 2, Ephraim and Manasseh. So the northern kingdom was basically the descendants of the patriarch Joseph. And in Jewish mythology, the first task of the Messiah was to bring together the broken Jewish nation. So you have to bring together Judah and Joseph. Matthew, in his genealogy with which he opens his gospel, says that Jesus is descended from King David, goes down through the kings. That's the tribe of Judah, so that's covered. Then by making the earthly father a man named Joseph, he brings the northern kingdom together so that in his infancy, Jesus unites both parts of the Jewish people. That's a big agenda. Another reason might be that if you go into the Old Testament, the name of Jesus is written Joshua, Joshua. It's the same name. Joshua is just an Aramaic or Hebrew spelling. Jesus is a Greek spelling, but it's the same name. There are 2 Josephs, 2 Joshuas, 2 Jesuses, 2 Joshuas in the Old Testament. One's the guy who fought the Battle of Jericho, who succeeded Moses. And if you read his biography, you'll discover that he's of the tribe of Joseph, so his father is named Joseph. The second Joshua is mentioned, I think it's in Obadiah, but not everybody reads Obadiah very frequently. But he's also mentioned in the first 8 chapters of Zechariah, which is read a little bit more. And in the 3rd chapter, he's a high priest, Joshua, Jesus the high priest. And he's got a father whose name is Jehozadak, or Josadak, which is a variation of the name Joseph. So every other Jesus in the Old Testament has a Joseph as his father. So you have 2 pieces of data that might put that together. Now, hold your criticism or your doubt for just a minute, and then ask, well, if this is a fictitious character, a literary character that Matthew has created, where does he get the data to describe, the biographical data, to describe this Joseph? And you can read it. It's all in chapters 1 and 2 of Matthew. It's the only place you have biographical data. And if you read Matthew 1 and 2, you discover 3 things about Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus. 1, he's got a father named Jacob. 2, God never speaks to him except in a dream. Over and over again, God speaks to him, but only in a dream. And 3, his role in the drama of salvation is to save this child of promise from death at the hands of Herod. And how does he save him? He saves him by taking him down into Egypt. Now go back into the book of Genesis and read the story of Joseph the patriarch, chapters 37 to 50 of the book of Genesis. And there you'll find 3 things. 1, this Joseph has a father named Jacob. 2, this Joseph is overwhelmingly identified with dreams. He's called a dreamer. He rides into power by interpreting the dreams of the Pharaoh's butler and the Pharaoh's baker, and then of the Pharaoh himself. And 3, his role in the drama of salvation is to save the people of the covenant from death by famine, and the way he saves them is to take them down into Egypt. Now, do you think all that is accidental? Or have you begun to see how the Gospels are Jewish books weaving together the stories of the Jewish past that Jews would immediately recognize, but about which Gentiles would be abysmally ignorant? And so from about 150 to about the middle of the 20th century, the only people who read, interpreted, and wrote commentaries on the Gospels were Gentiles who were ignorant of the Jewish tradition. And what we've begun to do in the last 50 years of the 20th century is to be in much deeper dialogue with our Jewish ancestry and our Jewish roots, and that's what's illumining the biblical story in fantastic ways. Anyway, I hope that's a helpful illustration. We'll take one final question from a gentleman, and then we'll be finished. Here comes the male Oprah.
I think I must have misheard one of two things I thought
Is
I heard
that
you
on?
s-
I'm not hearing you very well.
Okay. I think I must have misheard one of two things thought I heard you say. Initially, I thought you said that John's gospel does not cover the resurrection. But then later, that John's gospel does not cover the resurrection. John's gospel does not cover the resurrection? You didn't? I understand.
Covers it in 4 stories, but it climaxes his story on the cross, and the resurrection sort of plays out of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank all of you. I hope some of you will come back tomorrow. It's Roger's job to get you out tonight. It's my job to get you out tomorrow. So I'll see you then.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.